That's impossible. Those messages aren't real.
They came directly from your account.
Do you have any explanation? I can explain. $14 missing. That's all the proof I need.
Are you absolutely sure?
You're finished here.
Then let's see what happens next.
Sir, you need to see this. What have you done?
Nothing. I simply moved my money.
$28 million!
Wait, go back. That shouldn't be there.
What did you find?
He planned this before it happened. This wasn't a mistake.
You didn't fire me because of $14. You fired me because you were afraid of what I found.
No, that's not what happened.
The records say otherwise.
You thought nobody would check the numbers, but I did.
Nia Ellison was standing in the middle of the banking floor when Preston Blackwell held up a $14 discrepancy report like it was evidence of a capital crime. And in front of every colleague and client who happened to be watching, he called her careless, called her dishonest, and then summoned the security guard to collect her badge before she had finished her first sentence in response. Nia did not beg, and she did not try to explain herself a second time, because the pre-printed termination file, already tucked under Preston's arm, had told her everything she needed to know about whether this conversation was ever intended to be a conversation. She set her desk keys on the counter, reached into her pocket, and dialed a number Preston Blackwell had never seen her use, a number she had memorized years before she ever walked through the doors of this building. 10 minutes later, his management screen lit up with a transfer notice that drained the color from his face and made the entire branch go quiet. $28 million was leaving Crestmont National Bank, and there was nothing Preston could do to stop it. Stay until the very end, because that missing $14 was only the door to a fraud no one was supposed to find. It was a Monday morning at the Charlotte branch of Crestmont National Bank, the kind of morning that begins with clean desks and quiet confidence. When Nia Ellison completed a routine cash transaction for a business client, and the teller system flagged a $14 shortfall at her drawer. The amount was so small that under any standard procedure, the next step would have been a recount, a second pair of eyes on the bills, a review of the transaction log, a look at the security feed, before anyone drew a conclusion about anything, and Nia knew that, which was why she called out to her supervisor before the discrepancy notice had even finished generating. But Preston Blackwell appeared at the edge of the floor almost before the words left her mouth, and what he carried was not a recount form or a supervisor's notebook. It was a full disciplinary file, printed and tabbed and paper-clipped, the kind of document that takes the better part of an hour to prepare. That detail lodged itself immediately in Nia's mind, because a person who has just learned about a $14 shortfall does not already have a termination packet ready, not unless the shortfall was never a surprise to them in the first place. Preston walked her into the glass-walled conference room at the center of the floor, the one that looked out onto every workstation and every client seating area, and he did not lower his voice when he spoke because he was not interested in discretion. He was interested in an audience. He told her that Crestmont National Bank could not afford to employ people who were not fully trustworthy, that the amount in question made no difference, whether it was $14 or $14,000, because the principle was what mattered, and the principle here was clear. Nia listened without raising her voice, her hands flat on the conference table, and when he finished, she told him that she had locked her drawer according to every protocol on the checklist, and that Claire Whitaker, the branch's deputy operations director, had been the only other person near that cash station during the lunch hour. Claire was seated 2 desks away, and she shook her head at once, saying she had been running a system check at the manager's request and had touched nothing. Preston did not ask for the verification Nia had requested, no camera review, no second count, no call to IT. He announced the termination aloud, told the security officer near the front entrance to collect Nia's badge and access card, and said she would be escorted from the building immediately. The floor behind the glass was still in the way that rooms go still when something has gone wrong that everyone can feel, but no one is willing to name, and several of Nia's colleagues looked down at their screens as if staring at a spreadsheet would excuse them from witnessing what was happening. A few others watched openly, and in their expressions Naya could read the familiar arithmetic that people sometimes run when they see a black woman accused of taking money. The quiet, uncomfortable calculation where $14 becomes a summary of character rather than a number that still needed to be verified. She did not cry, and she did not raise her voice, because neither of those things would have changed what Preston had already decided, and she had understood that the moment she saw the pre-printed file under his arm. She asked him one question before she stood, whether he was certain he wanted to finalize this decision before reviewing all accounts associated with her file. Preston offered a short, dismissive smile, said he was not in the habit of taking instruction from employees he had just terminated, and told her she was welcome to pursue whatever channels she believed were available. Nia picked up her bag, left the access card on the table, walked to the client waiting area near the main entrance, sat down, took out her phone, and dialed a number from memory. The person on the other end answered on the second ring, and Nia's voice was entirely steady when she said, "Eleanor, go ahead and activate the emergency withdrawal clause." Nia had not left the building. She had simply stopped being an employee of it and started being something else entirely, a client representative seated in the public waiting area with full legal authority over an account whose scale Preston Blackwell had never bothered to understand. Eleanor Pierce confirmed over the phone that the fund's board of directors had reviewed Nia's risk assessment memo from the previous week and had formally authorized the transfer upon her request, which meant every step in the chain of command required to move $28 million was already in place before Nia had walked through the branch doors that morning. The authentication process took Nia 6 minutes on the secure client portal of the Ellison Community Growth Fund, the investment organization she had co-founded years before joining Crestmont, and when the final confirmation cleared, the receiving institution, a regional competitor of Crestmont located 14 miles away, acknowledged the incoming wire within seconds. On Preston Blackwell's management terminal on the other side of the lobby, a liquidity alert appeared in red, flagging an outgoing balance request on what the system listed as the branch's largest corporate account, and Preston assumed it was an error and cleared it without reading the account name. When the second alert appeared with a status bar showing that the first phase of a multi-step wire transfer had already settled, he looked at the account holder line more carefully, and the name there was not a corporation he recognized. It was a community investment fund, and the authorized executive representative listed beneath it was Nia Ellison. His face changed in the way that faces change when a joke arrives in full, and lands entirely on the person who was supposed to be laughing. He crossed the lobby in fewer steps than it should have taken, and when he reached Nia, he told her in a voice pitched low that she was making a serious mistake, that moving funds in the middle of a personnel dispute would be characterized as retaliation, that he would have the transaction flagged for fraud review before the second phase cleared. Nia looked up at him with the same measured calm she had maintained in the glass conference room, and told him she was not moving the bank's money, and was not moving any other client's funds. She was moving the money belonging to the organization she had legal authority to represent, whose board had determined 7 days ago that the current branch environment constituted an unacceptable fiduciary risk, and she said all of it at a volume that carried, because Preston had not offered her the courtesy of privacy when it was her reputation at stake. The transaction officers at the 2 nearest stations had stopped typing. 3 clients in the waiting area were no longer reading the materials they had picked up from the display rack, and one of them, a man in a gray suit with a leather portfolio on his knee, was watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone deciding whether to believe what he is seeing. Preston said he was going to call the main office and have the transfer frozen pending an investigation, and Nia nodded and said he was welcome to try, but that in order to freeze a valid authorized wire, the bank would need to articulate a legal basis, and she did not believe one existed. He reached the branch operations desk and demanded a freeze, and the system confirmed that the account's documentation was fully compliant, the representative's authorization was current and multi-verified, and there was no regulatory mechanism to block it without a court order or a fraud claim backed by documented evidence, neither of which Preston had. The second phase of the transfer completed. The branch alert system logged the departure of $28 million from a single corporate account, and within the same automated cycle, a secondary flag appeared in the audit queue. The departing account had been cross-referenced with a cluster of internal transaction anomalies that had been sitting in the system's unreviewed folder for 14 months. 3 years before that Monday morning, Nia Ellison had been sitting at a kitchen table in the neighborhood where she grew up, helping her mother sort through the financial records of 4 small businesses that a community loan officer had told were not creditworthy enough for standard products. Her mother had spent decades working as a bookkeeper for local shop owners, building an informal network of trust that moved small amounts of capital between businesses in a way that large banks never offered and never tried to understand. And Nia had grown up watching that system function because it was built on accountability rather than collateral. When her mother became ill, Nia's career slowed. She had been on a track toward a senior advisory role at a regional firm, but she stepped back to provide care for several years, and by the time her mother passed, those years had been traded for something that could not be quantified on a resume, but had permanently reshaped the way she understood money and the people who needed it. She used what remained of her savings, along with a small inheritance and the contributions of 4 co-founders, to establish the Ellison Community Growth Fund, a private investment vehicle designed to support businesses owned by women and people of color who were routinely excluded from traditional lending. She took the position at Crestmont partly for the income and partly because she believed that understanding a large financial institution from the inside would make her a more effective advocate for her clients from the outside, and she disclosed her affiliation with the fund during the hiring process, listed it on every compliance form, and made no effort to keep it secret, but she also made no effort to broadcast it, because she had learned early in her career that certain kinds of power carry more weight when they are exercised quietly. Victoria Langford had heard about the fund through a contact in impact investing, and after reviewing 2 years of the fund's performance data, she had requested a meeting with Nia, which lasted 3 hours and ended with a capital commitment that would eventually bring the fund's total assets to $28 million. Victoria was not known for sentiment. She was known for return rates and governance structures and the specific ability to identify fund managers who prioritized long-term outcomes over visible ones. And what she saw in Nia was a person who understood that capital was a tool rather than an end, which was rarer in practice than it sounded in principle. Preston had known only that Nia was affiliated with a community fund. He had never asked for specifics because he had assumed the clients associated with her work did not represent the profile the branch was designed to serve. In the 2 years since Nia had joined the branch, Preston had systematically routed high-net-worth clients away from her caseload and toward Claire Whitaker, who fit his apparent model of what the branch's ideal relationship officer looked like, and he had reassigned Nia to the complex loan cases with difficult processing timelines, then used the resulting metrics to mark her performance below the branch average in a way that only worked if no one asked where the numbers came from. He had evaluated her on inputs he had engineered rather than outcomes she had produced, and Nia had documented the pattern in writing in her own files, because a mentor had advised her years earlier to document what she could not yet prove. It was while reviewing a cluster of business accounts that she had helped through difficult periods that she first noticed unusual advisory fees appearing on quarterly statements. Small amounts, between $8 and $49 per cycle, attributed to a vendor name she did not recognize. She ran the name through the branch's approved supplier registry and found nothing, searched the bank's procurement disclosures and found nothing, and then ran it through a commercial database and found that Blackwell Strategic Services had been registered 14 months prior, that its listed address was a residential property in a suburb of Charlotte, and that its director shared a surname with the man who had just assigned her the quarterly audit caseload. She began quietly saving documentation and sent a summary to Malcolm Hayes in the bank's internal audit division, and she said nothing out loud, because she understood that the value of what she had found depended entirely on not letting the person she had found it about know she was looking. Malcolm Hayes arrived at the branch before noon on the day of the termination, because the automatic compliance flag generated by the departing $28 million account had triggered a protocol requiring a physical audit presence. And Malcolm, who had been monitoring patterns at the Charlotte branch for most of a year without enough documented evidence to act, had been assigned to the response. He was calm in the way that experienced investigators are calm, the stillness of someone who has learned to let data speak at its own volume rather than trying to accelerate it. And his first action was to request that all drawer access logs and camera data for that morning be locked before anything was modified. Preston objected, characterizing the termination as a routine personnel matter that had been resolved internally. But Malcolm informed him in a level tone that the size and timing of the outgoing transfer had elevated the matter beyond what the branch could characterize as routine, and that the request was not optional. The drawer access log showed something that someone had apparently expected would be buried before anyone looked at it. At 11:47 in the morning, while Naya was on her documented lunch break, the cash drawer assigned to her station had been opened using a manager-level override code, accessed for 47 seconds, and then resecured, and the override credentials in the log belonged to Claire Whitaker. 16 minutes after that access, Preston's own login appeared in the transaction history, alongside a timestamp modification on the reconciliation entry, meaning the time recorded for the end-of-session cash count had been manually changed to make the discrepancy appear to have existed from the start of Naya's shift rather than appearing midday. The surveillance camera directly above the cash station had experienced a 90-second recording gap at the exact relevant window, attributed in the maintenance log to a scheduled system refresh that, on Ethan, had not been scheduled that morning and had not affected any other camera in the building. The hallway camera, positioned at an angle that captured a partial reflection off the glass partition between the teller area and the back corridor, had experienced no gap at all, and it showed Claire walking from the direction of Nia's station during the relevant window, carrying what appeared to be a small amount of paper currency and coin. When Malcolm showed Claire that footage, she did not deny what it showed, but she said the instructions had come from Preston, that he had told her the exercise was a standard integrity verification, the kind management ran periodically on tellers under review, and that any discrepancy created would be corrected within the same business day. She said she had not asked for that in writing, because she had had no reason to question him, and she understood, watching Malcolm's expression, that not having asked for it in writing was the mistake that would define what came next. Malcolm found the termination letter draft in the branch system's document history, created from Preston's workstation at 9:41 the previous evening, more than 12 hours before the cash drawer discrepancy appeared on Nia's system. The letter cited financial dishonesty as the basis, included the specific amount of the discrepancy, and had been formatted for signature before the discrepancy had technically occurred. That sequence: termination letter written the night before, cash shortfall manufactured the following morning, termination executed before any review could take place, was not a coincidence and was not ambiguous. And Malcolm logged every timestamp as he found it because he had been trained to believe that evidence has its own life once properly recorded, and that the investigator's job is simply to let it continue. Naya had already understood the intent before the audit mechanics confirmed it. She had seen Preston near the teller area late on the previous Thursday evening, after the floor had largely cleared, with no apparent reason to be in that section, since his responsibilities did not include end-of-day teller reconciliation. And she had filed the observation in the same mental folder as all the other data points that did not yet have a shape: the reassigned clients, the suppressed performance numbers, the vendor name that shared his surname. By the time she walked in that Monday morning, she had understood that something was coming, even if she had not known the exact form it would take. Malcolm pulled the file associated with the code string B14 from a subdirectory nested 3 folders deep in the branch's transaction archive under a generic operational label, the kind of location that suggested someone had wanted it accessible enough to retrieve quickly, but obscure enough to survive a casual audit pass. The file contained 623 individual transaction records spanning 22 months, each one a small fee charged to a business account, ranging from $8 on the low end to $49 on the high end, clustered most densely in the $14 to $22 range, because amounts in that window were consistent with standard service fees and were unlikely to prompt a call from any client who was not already in the habit of reading every line of every statement. The aggregate total of all 623 transactions was $894,000.11, a number that in a single large wire transfer would have been noticed immediately, but distributed across small lines over nearly 2 years had passed through the system without triggering a single automated compliance flag. The money did not go directly to Preston Blackwell. It moved through a small network of vendor accounts, 3 consulting firms, and 2 technology service providers, all registered within the same 14-month window, all with minimal presence in any public record, and one of them, Blackwell Strategic Services, carrying an obvious structural connection to the branch director. When Malcolm ran the registrations for the other entities in the network, 2 of the 5 had been filed by the same notary, whose signature also appeared on Preston's home refinancing documents. The path was not elegant. It had been designed for opacity rather than artistry, the kind of layering that works when no one is looking and collapses quickly once someone is. And Malcolm photographed every document before logging a single access event in the audit system, because experience had taught him that people who build these structures often have access to the audit logs that document their discovery. The accounts targeted by the B14 code were not the branch's largest clients. They were small and mid-sized businesses, a dry cleaning operation, a family catering company, a women's health clinic, a landscaping firm, the kind of businesses that used commercial checking products and reviewed their statements once a month at best, many of them led by owners who had been told for years that understanding finance was someone else's area of expertise. A disproportionate number of those businesses were the ones Naya had been assigned to manage, which meant she was their closest point of contact at the bank, which meant she was the person most likely to notice the fees, and most likely to advocate for a refund when she did, and when she had requested reversals on behalf of those clients. Preston had overruled her consistently, telling her she was undermining branch revenue, and that her instinct to protect small account clients was a sign she was not suited for the commercial environment. Nia had not understood, during those conversations, that the fees she was trying to reverse were not going to the bank's general revenue. They were going directly into the network Preston had built, and her attempts to trace them back to a coherent service rationale had been the closest she came, without knowing it, to pulling the thread that would unravel the whole structure. The code B14 was a reference she had not deciphered until Malcolm laid out the full transaction map, and when she saw it clearly, she recognized something that was not satisfaction and not grief, but the understanding of a system that had used her own careful attention against her, that had stored its most incriminating data in a place it was certain she would never reach, and that had been prepared to sacrifice $14 as a distraction from nearly $900,000. Claire cooperated fully when Malcolm asked for her account of every instruction she had received from Preston across the previous 18 months. She acknowledged that she had processed fee categorization changes without fully questioning them, that she had noted several vendor payments as unusual in her own notes and had not escalated them, and that her ambition to demonstrate operational efficiency had led her to approve documentation she had not always read in full. Preston, meanwhile, had been moving toward the exit since the moment Conrad Ashbourne's name appeared on an incoming call to the branch main line, and security found him near the rear service corridor carrying a laptop, which a guard quietly but firmly redirected back to his office. Conrad Ashbourne, arrived at the Charlotte branch by early afternoon, accompanied by 2 members of the bank's legal department and the lead partner from the external accounting firm that handled Crestmont's compliance reviews. Because Victoria Langford had called his direct line at 10:47 that morning and had said, in the precise and unhurried tone she used when she had already made a decision and was informing other parties of it, that a woman managing $28 million of her capital had been publicly accused of stealing $14 by a branch manager whose own financial conduct she now had specific reasons to question, and that Crestmont had roughly 4 hours to demonstrate that it understood the difference between a personnel decision and a cover-up before she began making additional calls. Conrad had been aware of the Charlotte branch primarily through its quarterly profit reports, which had been consistently above the regional average, and had earned Preston a commendation at the previous year's leadership conference, and he had had no particular reason to examine those numbers more closely until now. Preston requested a private meeting with Conrad before anything else took place, and Conrad agreed to one procedurally, but he brought the legal team into the room and made clear the conversation would be recorded. Preston described Nia as a disgruntled former employee who had used her access to a client account to execute a punitive financial action against the institution that had terminated her, and he characterized the $28 million transfer as an act of professional retaliation that revealed instability rather than principle. He was composed when he said all of this, and he seemed genuinely to believe the framing would hold, that the bank's institutional interest in protecting its reputation would align with protecting him, because it often had before. Nia was not in the room when Preston made his case, but Eleanor Pierce was, and Eleanor had brought 3 documents. The Funds Board resolution authorizing the transfer, a written risk assessment Nia had filed with the Funds Governance Committee 7 days earlier, detailing the specific transaction irregularities she had identified at the branch, and a timeline showing the decision to move the assets had been made before Nia was terminated that morning. Eleanor stated calmly that those documents established the transfer as a reasoned fiduciary action rather than an emotional one, and that they also established that Crestmont had terminated a whistleblower without investigation, which created an independent legal exposure that existed regardless of what Preston had or had not done separately. Conrad read the risk assessment memo carefully, and what he read there was not vague suspicion. It was a documented account of specific vendor codes, fee patterns, and account access irregularities, assembled with the methodical discipline of someone who had spent years learning how financial systems could be made to deceive the people they were meant to serve. He turned to Preston and asked, without visible emotion, why a $14 drawer discrepancy had resulted in an immediate termination, without a second count, without a camera review, and without the basic procedural steps any supervisor was required to complete before issuing a final disciplinary action. Preston said the bank's conduct policy allowed for immediate termination in cases involving financial integrity, which was true as a policy matter, but did not answer the question of why those steps had been bypassed. And after a silence that lasted several seconds, he did not produce another answer. Conrad asked to see the full financial records for the branch's previous 2 fiscal years, including vendor payment ledgers and third-party consulting expenditures. And when those files appeared on the conference room screen, the number in the consulting fees column was not consistent with the level of advisory services a regional bank branch would ordinarily require. Malcolm presented the B14 audit summary. The legal team began taking notes. Victoria Langford joined via video from her office and said that she had invested in Nia's judgment not because of a personal relationship, but because Nia had never allowed a financial decision to be made for the wrong reasons, and that a bank willing to terminate a person of that caliber on the basis of a manufactured cash gap had demonstrated exactly the kind of governance failure that made institutional risk real rather than theoretical. Conrad asked Preston to remain in the building, pending a formal suspension while the audit was completed, and he said it in a way that made clear the outcome of that audit was not in significant doubt. The audit team then discovered, buried in an ancillary approvals file, that Conrad Ashbourne's own electronic signature had been copied to authorize a vendor contract worth $3,600,000, a contract neither Conrad nor anyone in his office had ever seen. When the weight of the evidence made denial untenable, Preston shifted to the only remaining move available to him, which was to position Claire Whitaker as the central actor in everything. The person who had accessed the drawer, created the discrepancy, managed the vendor relationships, and administered the fee codes, while framing himself as a branch director who had been poorly served by a subordinate he had trusted too completely. He told the legal team that Claire had come to him with a performance concern about Nia, that he had relied on Claire's account without independently verifying the records, and that any irregularities in the vendor accounts were the product of Claire's management of the operations caseload, which had been assigned to her with limited oversight. He was careful about it, framing each element as a failure of delegation rather than intent, and he seemed to understand that this version, careless and credulous but not criminal, was the only one that still left him with a viable position. Claire heard what Preston was doing from the hallway and came into the room without waiting to be invited. She placed her phone on the conference table face up, with a sequence of screenshots already open. Text messages from Preston's personal number, sent across 4 days the previous week, in which he had given her specific sequential instructions to create a $14 shortfall at Nia's drawer, restrict Nia's system access permissions before the shift began, draft a misconduct notice using the integrity clause language from the employee handbook, and move 3 of Nia's largest commercial accounts to a different relationship officer before end-of-day Monday. A 5th message, sent the night before the termination, read, "Once she is gone, no one else is close enough to the data to connect the numbers." Claire had taken the screenshots on the night that last message arrived, after something in its phrasing had made her understand for the first time that she was not participating in a management exercise. She was being positioned for a fall, and she had been precise enough to preserve the evidence before she'd decided what to do with it. Preston moved toward the phone, and the guard near the door stepped forward, not aggressively but with complete authority, and Preston stopped and stood very still. He said Claire was fabricating the messages, that her device had been compromised, that screenshots could be manipulated, and each statement sounded less credible than the one before it. Not because any of them were individually impossible, but because accepting all of them simultaneously required believing that Malcolm's audit data was false, that Claire's screenshots were fabricated, that Eleanor's documents were mistimed, and that Nia had somehow engineered a $28 million financial maneuver in retaliation for a $14 accusation she had known about for fewer than 30 minutes. The architecture of the alternate reality Preston was offering did not hold under its own weight. Nia came into the room near the end of this. She had spent most of the afternoon in the client waiting area, and she came in because Eleanor had asked her to be present when the legal summary was formally read, and she stood at the side of the room and listened without visible expression. Preston looked at her once, and in that look was something that might have been the beginning of remorse, or might have simply been the face of someone confronting consequences they had been certain would never arrive. He said that she had destroyed his career over a personnel dispute, and that what she had done was disproportionate. Nia did not raise her voice, and she did not smile. She said, "You did not lose your career because of $14. You lost it because you believed that people with less power than you would never check your numbers." Conrad formally suspended Preston pending transfer of the case to the State Financial Crimes Unit, and the order was signed before Preston left the building that afternoon, escorted out through the same entrance, where he had once directed security, to stand while Nia turned over her badge. News of the $28 million transfer moved through the financial community in Charlotte, the way news of unusual bank events always does. First as a rumor, then as a question, then as a story with enough specificity to resist efficient denial. Several commercial banking clients at other Crestmont branches requested audits of their own fee histories within the week, and 2 larger institutional depositors requested meetings with Conrad's office before Friday, which was not yet a crisis but was the unmistakable beginning of one if the bank's response did not carry convincing weight. Conrad reached out to Naya through Eleanor Pierce with an offer: full reinstatement with back pay, a formal public apology, and a regional director role with oversight authority over 3 branches, in exchange for an agreement to resolve the matter through a confidential settlement rather than litigation or press engagement. Nia did not accept, and she was not particularly tempted, because the structure of the offer was a confession dressed as a favor. The bank was asking her to absorb the silence of what had happened in exchange for her own professional advancement, which was the same calculation it had always made about her, that she could be satisfied with something smaller than the truth. She told Eleanor to convey that the problem at Crestmont was not Preston Blackwell. Preston was the product of a system that rewarded branches for profit numbers without ever investigating where those numbers came from, that promoted the performance of success rather than its substance, and that had resolved every previous complaint about the branch director by filing the complaint rather than examining it. What she was willing to discuss with legal counsel present were conditions under which the fund might consider redepositing assets at Crestmont once the bank had demonstrated a substantive change in posture. She said Crestmont needed to reimburse in full every B-14 fee charged to client accounts, which the audit had valued at just under $900,000. She said every employee who had been terminated, demoted, or given a negative evaluation as a result of resisting Preston's directives needed to have those records reviewed and remediated. She said the bank needed to establish a whistleblower reporting line structurally independent of branch management, routed directly to the compliance division at the holding company level, and that no branch manager should have the authority to adjudicate or suppress a complaint naming themselves as the subject. She said the audit findings should be provided in summary form to the clients whose accounts had been affected, because those clients deserved an explanation rather than a check with no context. Conrad agreed to all of it, not entirely because he wanted to, and not entirely because Victoria Langford had made clear that her willingness to maintain any assets at Crestmont was contingent on the bank's response, but also, Nia believed, because he was capable of recognizing that the institution he ran had failed in a fundamental way, and that recovering required doing something more than settling the complaint. Malcolm was designated to lead the expanded audit, which would eventually cover all branches in the Charlotte Metropolitan Division. Claire was placed on administrative suspension rather than terminated, and her cooperation was noted in the legal summary as a mitigating factor, though the investigation of her own conduct remained open. The refund process for affected clients was initiated within 10 days, and the bank drafted individual letters for each client explaining in plain language what the fees had been, why they had been charged, and that they were being returned because they should not have existed. An elderly woman who had operated a neighborhood flower shop for 31 years came to the branch on the day the first refund checks were distributed, not to collect a check. Her amount was small enough that she had already received it by mail, but to find Nia, whom she had heard about through a mutual contact. She told Naya that she had not understood for 3 years why her end-of-month numbers never quite reconciled the way she expected them to, that she had assumed for all that time she was simply not careful enough at keeping track, and that knowing it had not been her carelessness but someone else's deliberate choice gave her something she had not expected to feel. Not relief exactly, but a restoration of her own competence in her own memory. Nia left Crestmont without returning to work there in any capacity, which several people in her professional network found surprising, given the settlement terms and the offered title, and which she found entirely consistent with who she had always been. She had not entered banking to manage a large institution. She had entered it to learn the language well enough to help the people the institution did not want to serve. And she had learned it, and she had finished with it. And the next step was to build something that had the language and the values, and none of the architecture that had made Preston Blackwell possible. Victoria Langford had been thinking about the same question from a different angle. And when the two of them sat down 2 weeks after the settlement was signed, they arrived at the same answer from their respective directions. The Ellison Community Growth Fund needed a full-time executive director. The role needed to be held by someone whose professional standing was not contingent on a bank's willingness to tolerate her. And Naya was the only person Victoria had encountered in 20 years of impact investing who met all three of those criteria at once. The fund's mandate remained what it had always been: capital access for business owners systematically underserved by traditional lending. But the structure around that mandate became more formal, more durable, and more transparent than it had been when Nia was running it from a part-time role alongside a full-time banking position. She hired a small team, including a community outreach coordinator who had previously worked in nonprofit housing finance and understood the specific language small business owners needed to hear from a financial institution before they trusted it. She built a client-facing portal that displayed every fee in plain English, with a direct explanation of what service it corresponded to and a documented process for requesting a review, because she had come to understand that the opposite of financial exploitation was not only honesty. It was legibility, the radical act of making a system understandable to the people it was supposed to serve. Malcolm resigned from Crestmont when the expanded audit was complete, having concluded that his skills would have more leverage from a position where he was not operating inside the system he was supposed to check, and he joined the fund as its director of risk and governance. The 14 months he had spent watching patterns he could not yet prove, the decision to lock the data before anything was touched, the patience to let the timestamp sequence tell its own story. All of it translated directly into the kind of institutional monitoring framework Nia wanted built into the fund's operations from the beginning. Several of the small businesses that had been Nia's clients at Crestmont moved their accounts to the fund's partner institutions. Not because she had asked them to, but because they had been watching what happened, and had concluded that the people who built a system transparent about its failures were more trustworthy than those who had spent 2 years hiding them. Preston was indicted on 7 counts, including wire fraud, misappropriation of client funds, fraudulent document creation, and conspiracy to obstruct a financial investigation. The assets he had accumulated through the shell company network were frozen pending legal proceedings, and 2 of the shell entity principals entered plea agreements before the case went to trial. Crestmont paid a regulatory penalty for insufficient internal controls and published a summary audit report as part of the compliance conditions Eleanor Pierce had negotiated into the settlement. A few weeks after the fund's new governance documents were filed, an envelope arrived at Nia's office from Crestmont's legal department. A brief formal letter of apology signed by Conrad Ashbourne, and clipped to it, behind a small frame, $14 in exact bills and coin, which the bank's communications team had apparently understood as a gesture of acknowledgement, and which Nia received as exactly that. 1 year after the morning she had been escorted from the floor of Crestmont National Bank with her badge in a security officer's hand, Nia Ellison stood at the entrance of the Ellison Community Growth Fund's new headquarters in Charlotte, a building that had previously housed a shuttered community lending cooperative and had been renovated on a budget that reflected both the fund's values and its operating discipline. The $28 million that had left Crestmont on that Monday afternoon had not sat idle. It had been deployed across a portfolio of loans and investments supporting 31 businesses, 6 of which had used the capital to add full-time employees within their first year of fund partnership, and one of which had just signed a municipal contract that its owner said she had been told for years was beyond the reach of a business her size. The fund had also grown since then, because Victoria Langford had added to her commitment, after the events at Crestmont had demonstrated that Nia's governance instincts were exactly what they had appeared to be, and because several other institutional investors had done what institutional investors do when they see a track record and a structure they trust. They had asked how to participate. In the main lobby of the building, Nia had mounted 2 things on the wall facing the entrance. One was a copy of the termination letter, the version Preston had drafted the night before, time-stamped at 9:41 in the evening before any discrepancy had officially occurred, and next to it, behind glass, was the framed $14 bill Conrad had sent, with the bank's letter of apology visible behind it. Beneath both frames was a single line on a plaque. No number is too small when it is being used to hide the truth. She had not put it there as a monument to what had been done to her. She had put it there as an orientation for everyone who walked through the door, a reminder that the reason financial transparency mattered was not abstract, but had a very specific and very human cost, and that the work of this institution was to keep that cost from being invisible. Crestmont invited Naya to speak at a banking ethics reform conference it hosted 6 months after the settlement closed. Partly a genuine attempt at institutional change, and partly the public positioning that organizations undertake when they need to demonstrate they have processed a crisis rather than merely survived one. Naya accepted after some deliberation because the people in that room, branch directors, compliance officers, regional managers, were exactly the audience that needed to hear what she had to say, and declining would leave the stage to people with less direct knowledge of where the system's failures actually lived. She did not give a speech about her own experience. She gave a talk about the structural conditions that had allowed a branch director to charge 623 fraudulent fees over 22 months, without triggering a single automated review, and she asked the room to consider what it said about their institutions, that the most effective audit mechanism in that situation had turned out to be a woman who had been fired for stealing $14. Conrad Ashbourne rose from the audience at the end of her remarks and offered an apology that was, by the standard of corporate public statements, unusually specific. He said that the bank had been prepared to believe the account of a senior manager over the documented record of a black woman with a clean performance history. Not because anyone had made a conscious decision to apply a different standard, but because the systems for evaluating credibility had been built in a way that encoded that difference without naming it, and that recognizing it now did not undo what had happened, but was the only honest starting point for doing something different. Naya let the apology stand without adding to it, because she understood that the measure of an apology of that kind was not what it felt like in a conference room, but what it looked like in a policy document 12 months later, and she had already negotiated the policies. A young woman who had recently started in the bank's commercial lending department caught Nia near the exit after the conference ended and asked her why, on that Monday morning, she had not told Preston immediately that she managed $28 million. Why she had allowed the termination to proceed rather than producing that fact as a defense. Naya thought about the question for a moment and said, "Because the point was never that $28 million made me worth treating fairly. $14 did not make me a thief, and $28 million did not make me honest. The amount was never the argument." She paused and then added, "If I had needed to reveal the money to be believed, then the money would have been the only thing protecting me, and I wanted something that worked for the next woman who didn't have it." In the final days of that year, there was a small ceremony at the original Charlotte branch, at which the last of the B-14 refund checks was formally presented, held in the glass conference room at the center of the floor, the room where Preston Blackwell had once held up a $14 discrepancy report like a verdict, and where every workstation could still see in through the newly clear panels. The room had been converted into an employee and client advocacy office, the first of its kind in the Crestmont system, and the frosted glass privacy panels had been replaced with transparent ones, because someone had decided in the aftermath of everything that transparency in that particular space was not just aesthetically appropriate, but structurally necessary. Nia stood at the front of the room and looked out at the teller stations where she had once worked, at the counter where the security officer had waited for her badge, at the main entrance, through which she had been escorted out on a Monday morning as though she were something the building needed to expel. Malcolm stood beside her and asked quietly whether she felt satisfied now that Preston had lost everything he had built. Naya shook her head slowly and said, "What satisfies me is not that he lost power. What satisfies me is that from now on, someone else won't lose their job just because a man with power needed to hide $14. She walked out through the main entrance of the bank into the late afternoon light. Not escorted, not watched, not carrying a $14 accusation designed to follow her out the door. But as the woman who had stood in that same lobby while Preston Blackwell held a discrepancy report over her head like proof of everything he had already decided, and who had set her badge down quietly, made one phone call, and begun the process of dismantling every number he had ever hidden behind.